Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. We're going to get right to the show after these messages. You know, I love podcasting. I have since 2006, back when you had to use like a Dixie cup with string to make the thing work. And that's why I'm so excited that we recently moved Mysterious Goings On to Anchor FM to record our podcast. I gotta tell you, I don't regret it a bit. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. I'm not going to lie to you, when I first heard about Anchor, I was a little dubious because I've been doing it the hard way for so long. But I got to tell you, it's very easy. Use a Stripe account. Get sponsors. You're not paying monthly hosting fees. The sound quality is great. The distribution is phenomenal. Friends, download the free Anchor app today if you want to start your own podcast, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Remember, you heard it here first on Mysterious Goings On. August 26, 2020 was the 100th anniversary of when the federal government certified states' ratification of the 19th Amendment pertaining to voting rights for women. I don't know about you, but I'll never forget the look on my civic-minded 12-year-old daughter when I told her that women did not always have the right to vote in this country. She could not believe that half the citizens had no voice. And as we used to say back in Oklahoma, where I grew up, that fired her up. Well, that's one reason why it's never been clear to me that the role of women in building this nation is a story we must tell in as many ways as possible to ignite a spark of imagination, understanding, and empowerment in the coming generations, to cast a light on indispensable need for all citizens, particularly women, to be active participants in the life of our nation. That's why I'm excited to welcome authors Rebecca Roberts, daughter of the legendary Cokie Roberts, and Lucinda Robb, granddaughter of Lady Bird Johnson, here to the show. Their new book, just released in October, right before that historic election, which never seems to end, The Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World. It's both a practical guide to becoming a change maker and a look back at the struggle for women's rights, written as a tribute to their mothers and grandmothers. It's a bit of a pacifist, The Art of War, with a hint of how to make friends and influence people. This small playbook format is easily digestible with secrets to succeeding in your activism. And each secret, which is what I love about this, is tied to a particular woman, including Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Ida B. Wells. Rebecca Roberts and Lucinda Robb, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah. Before we get into the nitty gritty, I have to do this. I have to make an observation as someone who has worked in PR and marketing for nearly 30 years. Some of the strategies our suffragette foremothers used to pass the 19th Amendment seem oddly familiar to my personal playbook and what I do. I mean, women's marches, publicity stunts, optics and influencers, raising money, door knocking, lobbying. I mean, this book's not only about history and an explainer about the suffragist movement, but it's also a political action marking and promotion how-to guide, isn't it?
Yeah, and that was really important to us because we want people to know the history because we want people to be educated Americans, but we also want them to know the history because the suffragists won, right? They effected this massive change to American democracy without resorting to, armed rebellion. So the fact that they were able to, in some cases, invent, in some cases, perfect these techniques are terrific lessons for activists today, regardless of your cause, no matter what it is you're trying to get done. So yes, the first March on Washington, the first time someone picketed the White House, all of the tactics about taking an event that didn't quite go your way and twisting the story around so that it actually works for you, managing your visuals, making a message go viral, all of these things that you see contemporary activists do over and over again, sometimes on purpose in homage to the suffragists, but much more often unknowingly walking in the footsteps of the women who did it first and did it really well 100 years ago.
That's fantastic. And so there's a great little moment here in the book. You're talking about as early as 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams and, as the president, and asked him to remember the ladies and, quote, be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. And what I love is you write right after that, well, we think this is a great idea in general, but it's not quite a plan.
I think one of the things that really appealed to both Becca and myself is coming from the background that we do. Both of us have grown up in politics, and Rebecca in journalism. It's not just history in the sense of, these are the dates and these are the places and, this sort of long litany of bills were passed and things that happened. We really wanted to focus on how did it all come together and what made it work. And I think that's one of the things that's so, the suffrage movement took a long, long time, over 70 plus years. It had 3 generations. And in fact, the first generation of women all lived to the ripe old age of in their late 80s, and I think 3 or 4 of them all lived to be about 86. Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frances Watkins Harper, all lived to be 86. None of them, none of that first 3 actually lived to see the 19th Amendment passed. But when you have such a long view, it does give you the ability to see what are the trends, what's happening, what's working. And it gives you that sort of 30,000 foot observation to say, aha, look what over and over again works. This is what needs to be done. And from there on, it became sort of a really natural way for us to put the book together. We start off with the importance of telling your story, setting a goal, particularly one that I think is important for activists today, never giving up. I think most activists think it takes longer to get something done than they really like. But if you stick to it, you do have those successes. They're just going to be so incremental that you're not going to notice them all right away. And I think that made it particularly fun for us, sort of thinking, what are the things that we can take from this long, historic, and as Becca said, ultimately successful movement? And, how can we distill them down into something that is useful and practical now?
So what's the genesis of the book, if I may ask? Are you both longtime friends? How does that work?
I actually worked at the National Archives, and I was there working on a project on women's petitions to Congress back at the time of the 75th anniversary of women's suffrage. And so as we got closer to this anniversary, I was talking to a lot of my friends saying, I wonder what's going to be happening, what people are going to do to plan for it. And I was surprised to find so many of my contemporaries knew so little about the suffrage movement. In fact, I had a really good friend who has a PhD in finance, and she said she couldn't name one suffragist. Now, I live here in Virginia where we get really deep into history, particularly the Civil War, and there are people who can name more horses in the Civil War. And I thought, well, we've got to do something about that. I happened to our families go back a long time. And our grandmothers were friends, our mothers were friends. There's an old joke in our family that Becca's older brother, who was born a few days before I was, sent me a telegram right after I arrived saying, I've been waiting for you all my life, which my mother interpreted to mean for a long time that somehow we were supposed to be affianced or something like that. But I went to a book signing with my mom for Becca's book on the 1913 parade in Washington. And I was talking to her, I said, we ought to do some sort of, graphic novel or something to sort of get people familiar with this as this big anniversary is coming up. And we wound up developing a plan, and we pitched it to a publisher, and they really liked it. And then we realized we didn't have nearly enough time to do all the artwork. And we thought, well, that's it. And then our publisher at Candlewick read Becca's book on the plane and called us back and said, we must do something. And Becca's book is really good. I love her first book. Just give a little plug on that, not this book.
Thanks there, Lucinda.
And so we were, thinking around about ideas. And I said, well, let's do one on the lessons of the suffrage movement. Actually, my initial title that I tried to suggest was The Secrets, 9 Secrets of the Suffrage Movement. In part because I used to work for a company where we did an enormous amount of market research. And my boss always used to joke that the one title that he could sell that everybody would buy was this secret Nazi sex diet. Now, we didn't have any Nazis or diet, and our sex was just gender. But I thought, well, maybe we get secret, because those 4 words were the most sort of powerful marketing words that you could have. But we played with it, and we wound up changing the title to what it is right now, the Suffragist Playbook, because we really wanted to sort of specifically emphasize that this is something that you can use. But it does. We've had a long history, and it's been particularly fun to work with Beck on a project. Not just you know, our families have been friends for so long, but this is the first time we've ever done any specific sort of work together, and it's actually been a blast.
It really has. I mean, it's worked out so much better than I think either of us could have anticipated. When Lucinda first started talking about doing some sort of a young reader's book on the suffrage movement, and I was completely enthusiastic, but we had no idea how that was going to work. We knew we had one major advantage, which is that the majority of Lucinda's scholarship has been on the 19th century and mine has been on the 20th century. And so we had this easy dividing line about who did what, and we had a nice complement of skills. But we had never taken on a project like this. And it turns out our writing skills complement each other really well too, because I've never met a first draft I didn't like. I mean, once I write something, I'm pretty ready to just set it and forget it. And Lucinda would actually still be editing the book right this second, let her have her hands on it. So between the two of us, I think we found a really nice rhythm of making each other's work better and still keeping to deadlines and still keeping things snappy. So I'm so proud of the result, and I'm just delighted with the whole process. And I think Lucinda and I both came out the other end of it still friends, still admiring each other, and still committed to telling this story.
You know, listen, go ahead, sorry.
I was just saying, I admire her even more.
Well, listeners, you can't see them, but they're both smiling ear to ear. I don't think you can fake that. You know, they say if you can fake sincerity, you've got it all going on, but I don't think they are. You know, Rebecca, your book, incidentally, was Suffragists in Washington, D.C., the 1913 parade and the fight for the vote and historic congressional cemetery. Oh, and you also wrote and historic congressional cemetery there. If you don't mind, we'll link to those in the show notes if that's cool.
Fantastic. Always have to plug other books.
Hey, I think once you read the handbook, you're going to want to dig deeper, folks. That's why I want to do that. But let me ask you this. Okay, I had not really understood this fully. The term suffragette. Now, tell me if I'm right or wrong here, and please do tell me I'm wrong. I'm used to being told. Now, that term was not used as a kindness at first, was it?
Right. It was an insult. So the word is suffragist, right? The proper word is suffragist. The British press made fun of the suffragists in England by calling them suffragettes. It was meant to be patronizing, right? Oh, you cute little suffragette. And the activists there, like many activists since, this is another tactic you see all the time, took that word, co-opted its own power, used it for themselves, used it proudly. So most properly, the word is suffragist. Suffragette refers to the British movement, even specifically the militant wing of the British movement. But in America, it was suffragists.
Now, I've also read that they actually hardened the G, as in suffragettes, as in we're going to get the vote.
That is one I have not heard. But there's all kinds of interesting little hidden messages in a lot of activism. You know, of course, there were overt messages too, but one of the things that you hear about the colors of the movement here in America, the broadest colors were golden, white, and violet, purple. But in England, they had green, white, and violet. And some people thought that was because it was the same initials as give women the vote. And so that if a woman wore like a emerald, pearl, and amethyst piece of jewelry, she was a sort of subterranean suffragist, and it was a way of spreading the message without being overt about it.
Oh, wow. I love that stuff. I love that. Whether it's true or not, I'm sure it is.
Makes
to a
a
degree.
Good story. Yeah.
Well, and that's what's great about your book. You talk about that, how certain things made a good story, right? Isn't there, if we could, I'll just go right into this, folks. Basically, every section, every chapter of this book is tied to the example of an historic figure who used these strategies and tactics to get ahead and try to move the ball forward on the movement. So, but wasn't there, there was a great story, ain't I a woman, right? And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name all of a sudden, but she had a story. Sojourner, thank you. She had a story that kept getting bigger and bigger, right?
Yes, Sojourner Truth And I have to call out another book that I didn't write by Nell Painter, who wrote a biography of Sojourner Truth back, I want to say in 1996, 97, that is wonderful. And she talks about her being an icon. And Sojourner Truth is someone whose legend has grown and gotten bigger over time. Which is amazing, since she was an incredibly impressive person to start with. I mean, she was born enslaved in New York, and people often forget that they had slavery in the northern states. She eventually was sold multiple times. Finally, New York had a process where you could they were getting rid of slavery, but in a very, very slow manner. So she belonged to someone who, when she had 5 children, and it was time for her to have a chance to be free. And her person who had owned her said, we'll go ahead, and if you do all of this hard extra work for me, I'll let you go free a year earlier. And then he reneged. And so she just took her last child and left. And she said, I didn't run away, I walked away. And she went to a neighbor who was an abolitionist, and eventually wound up working out an agreement to help her out. But her children were still, because they had not yet been freed, they were still with her former person who owned her. And that's one of the things that people, I think, don't realize in Sojourner Truth's life, is that she's having to balance this very difficult situation for a good part of her life. And some of her children wind up staying with him, her former owner, for a very long time. She wrote, and I say that with air quotation marks, she essentially dictated an autobiography. She managed to create for herself, despite the fact that she was not able to read or write. She memorized the Bible. She would have people read passages to her, and she liked to have children do it, because children didn't give as much editorial comment. She just wanted the facts, please. And she would go out and preach. And she was so successful at it, and everywhere that she went, that she started going to various different, and she had a strong, strong belief about the importance of justice. And that was sort of a running theme through her life. So she got involved in, obviously, the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement. She was part of the temperance movement. She was part of a lot of different things. And probably the speech that she is best known for is one that she gives in Ohio in 1850. And it goes on 12 years after she gives it. She's become something, because she's been so popular as a speaker and people have heard her. She's gotten a certain amount of fame, and a lot of white suffragists wind up writing about her. And one of them tells the story of this speech that she gave. And she has some of the themes of it right. And Sojourner Truth was an excellent speaker, and everyone sort of agrees, even though she didn't write down her speeches, and people didn't back then, you couldn't record it the way you could now to have an exact transcript of it. Everyone agrees she was very good. But the woman who 12 years later decides to put out this famous version that we know today called Ain't I a Woman, puts in a number of things that were not at all true. So for instance, she says that Sojourner Truth had 13 children. Well, Sojourner Truth had a lot of children, but she had 5. And I don't think you forget 7 children. As a mom myself, I can tell you that's not something that you just, you have a bad day and you somehow forget to mention. She also, again, she was from New York, and her first language was Dutch, actually. So she wouldn't have said something like ain't, which is sort of Southern dialect. So basically this white suffragist, she knows this is a great story. She winds up taking the themes and the basic idea and the outline of what Sojourner Truth had said. And we know from a print that was only recently found in an abolitionist newspaper later, where it sort of outlines much of her speech, that she does say, I can work as hard as a man, and I have worked, and she hits a lot of the themes. But a lot of the stuff that winds up becoming most famous, she probably didn't say it exactly that way. Now, Sojourner Truth was also pretty pragmatic. She realized that people were going to say things about her even when they weren't true. People were constantly adding years to her age and saying she was 105 when she was not at all. And I don't know any woman who really is crazy about that. But she understood also that sometimes publicity, especially good publicity that's not exactly the way you want it, right? You go ahead and you take it. And she had the opportunity in her lifetime to meet with 2 different presidents. She actually was influential where I live, in Arlington, Virginia. She helped do, after the Civil War, she was involved with the Freedmen's Bureau trying to help many of the formerly enslaved people figure out what they were going to do next with their life. And she was here for a year. She had a lot of different things that she cared about. And she used that fame that she got, however she got it, to advocate for the causes that were most important to her. But it is one of those things that sometimes you cannot control the narrative of your life and where it's going to go, and you just kind of figure out how to roll with it. It happens today. It happened back then.
Yeah, it's the whole thing about print the legend, because often the legend is more beneficial to your ultimate goal. So this book is rife with examples of people who understood how to play that game. And I don't mean game in a diminution of what was going on, but certainly in my line of work, there is a playbook, which this is what's so great about this. But for example, though, you've got all these lessons built into the book, that really could be just taken out of today. Tips on knowing your audience. Craft your image or others will do it for you. Use your network, steal ideas that work. And I found this whole thing so great. And what I love about it is, if you're not careful, you'll learn something reading this thing. You know what I mean? A lot of people will come for the tactics and strategies, but they'll come away with a better understanding of the people who built this movement and basically built this country. So when you did this, was it initially an idea of making it kind of split down the middle? Let's really be historical and share some history along with the tips, or was it first tips and then you just thought, the more and more historical we throw in? I know that's probably a little bit of a thread the needle question, but I'm just curious about where you started on that.
I think we went back and forth. The history is so compelling that we didn't have to add it in as a sort of take your medicine with the sugar kind of a thing. And the lessons or secrets or tactics or whatever you want to call them are that much more compelling if they've got history to back them up. So they fed off each other. I wouldn't say that we sat down and chose the lessons and then went back and found an anecdote to support them, or that there was history we definitely wanted to tell and then shifted to what tactic it taught. They both went back and forth. And it was pretty easy to map it out once we started thinking of it in those terms, because through a 72-year movement, they're going to try a lot of different things. And they're also going to encompass a whole lot of personalities. And I think that was another big lesson going forward to contemporary activists is, you don't need to be good at everything. If the idea of public speaking makes you want to throw up, or you would never in a million years ask somebody for money, or you have no art skills to build any kind of signage or website or Instagram, there's something else you can do, right? You don't need to be excellent at everything. In a big movement, there's room for everyone. And so in addition to wanting to showcase these women and give you a breadth of stories and breadth of tactics, we also just wanted the breadth itself to speak for the fact that there's a role for any activist in anything. And it was also, Alex, important to us to make sure that everyone understood these women were not perfect, that they made mistakes. And sometimes the lessons you learn are what not to do. And in particular, in the role of the suffrage movement, that was racism. There was classism too. There were plenty of other mistakes. But the overt racism of the movement, and sometimes more subtle racism of the movement, was something we didn't want to shy away from that. There was no point in pretending that didn't exist. If you're truly going to learn from this history, you need to learn from the counterexample as well.
In today's cancel culture environment, obviously you didn't feel any pressure when you're telling this history to say, okay. I mean, wasn't even Susan B. Anthony, didn't she have was it her, I'm sorry, who was somewhat racist or had some racist tendencies? You can't just ignore her and cut her out simply because it doesn't fit today's narrative. Is that fair?
I think one of the examples that I often find myself looking at is of somebody like Frances Willard, the most famous suffragist that nobody has ever heard of. And Frances Willard, one of the things, we talk a lot about radicals and moderates. And you need both for a movement. You have your radicals who sort of move the goalposts, and then you have your moderates who come along and actually move the ball. And Frances Willard, who was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union from 1879 to 1898, was probably in her day one of the, if not the best known American woman, probably the second best known woman in the world after Queen Victoria. So she was huge. She was the first woman to get a statue in Statuary Hall. We spent this whole summer talking about statues. She wouldn't be joined by another woman for 50 years. So she was a big deal. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union was the largest women's organization at the time, with hundreds of thousands of members. And what she did that was so successful, talk about marketing, she really knew her brand. Her brand was nice. And instead of saying, you know, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a lot of people have been talking about the moral right of having the vote. And Frances Willard doesn't get caught up in that. She talks about how having the vote, you're going to, all the good things you're going to be able to do with the vote, sort of what's in it for you. She's very practical. She talks about it as the home protection ballot and citizen motherhood. And these are all terms that are very attractive to her largely white, evangelical, conservative following. And she manages to get a whole lot of women who probably didn't have suffrage in the top 20 issues they cared about. And for that matter, men too. Interested in women having suffrage because they're going to do something valuable about it. And so in this sense, she's a huge proponent, and she really makes a big difference, I think, in the suffrage movement. But at the same time, probably if people have heard of Frances Willard at all today, it's because of the controversy with Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist, today we call her a data-driven journalist because she collected all of this incredible information on lynching all over the country, and particularly in the South, and published it and made it accessible. Ida B. Wells calls out Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she says, you know, the language that you're using is demonizing Black men. It's demonizing immigrants. This isn't just helping you win your cause. It's actually incredibly life-threateningly dangerous to my people. And she gradually shames Frances Willard into, you know, eventually the WCTU comes out with a position to you know, condemn lynching. But, you know, they hadn't been rushing to do it. And I think one of the interesting things I see when we talk about the racism in the movement is it's not like you start off with a lot of white supremacists who say, you know, I'd like to get involved in suffrage. You know, it's a lot of white suffragists who find themselves, without probably even being aware of how it's happening, becoming more and more racist as they try to get a amendment passed. You know, you have to get Southern states involved. And one of the arguments they make is just flat out and out, you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton makes it in particular, but a whole bunch of white suffragists make it. They call it educated suffrage. And that's the idea that only people, or only women who are educated, should have the right to vote, which of course is going to knock out immigrants. It's going to knock out Black women who, by and large, people who've been enslaved hadn't had the right to even get an education. It's sort of code word for only white women are going to get this vote. And as Frances Willard becomes more involved in the suffrage movement, and she winds up going down into the South and talking with white suffrage groups, you can see sort of the rhetoric and the emphasis that they have change. It's happening without them even noticing it. And I think what I hope happens when we read this book, you know, obviously in the past there was a sense that people would say, well, you have to understand things in context. And we don't want to excuse it away, although you do have to understand things in context, but still, that's no excuse. They're talking about a movement to make things more fair. And you can't avoid this big, huge blind spot that they have. And so now you have a position where people want to condemn them. And that's true. But I hope what people really get is, how did this happen? How did these women who are otherwise in so many ways incredibly progressive, and Frances Willard was enormously progressive, and a lot of it would probably never would have thought of herself as being racist. How did they wind up getting there? And when we look and we see what happened there, what are we doing today in the 21st century that mirrors that? How can we make sure we don't make that mistake, as Becca says, all over again?
Thinking as you're describing this and explain this to me is that we can look no further than today's politics without getting too deep in it. But it's my opinion that President-elect Biden won by forming a coalition, a big coalition of people across the voting spectrum. And it seems to mirror to a degree what you're talking about. I mean, he had Republicans who were never Trumpers. He has far left liberals. He has centrists. He had this coalition, and he got his arms around to help put him in. And it sounds like that's a very similar thing that had to be built there too, because one thing you did mention that I think I wasn't even going to mention was there were men involved in this too, right?
Men were, Becca, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think there are two things here. There's this sort of maturing of a movement where it starts to encompass more than one point of view. In fact, a continuum of points of view, that when something goes from being the germ of an idea to having broader social support, then you're going to have a range of what people support in that. And so there are going to be the people who pick at the White House and go to jail and go on hunger strikes and get arrested. And there are going to be people who sign a petition, and that's the extent of their involvement. And that is actually the sign of a mature movement, right? A broader umbrella, because it's appealing to a broader range of people. But there definitely is this question of recruiting allies as well. And I'll let Lucinda talk specifically about some of the men, but you have to remember, these women could not finish the job themselves, right? They could not run for office, introduce legislation, vote for it while female. So even after 72 years of working and changing minds and making incremental progress, they could not introduce, vote for, or ratify the 19th Amendment without men. They just couldn't. And so, and there was no man who benefited from it except to win over voters himself. And so that question of recruiting allies, which again, you're hearing constantly in today's activism, is another big lesson of the movement. And in the suffrage movement, it was, the allies were men.
Yeah, I mean, you have Frederick Douglass in the very beginning at Seneca Falls in 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote her Declaration of Sentiments, and she put forward this idea as one of the resolutions that women should have the vote. And with all of the people who showed up, most of them are Quakers. It's a pretty progressive crowd for the day. But even with them, this is going a little too far. So it looks like this is going to be the one resolution they have at the convention that's going to fail until Frederick Douglass stands up to speak in favor of it. And he says, he's a prominent abolitionist and journalist, and having once been enslaved himself, he says he knows what it's like not to have power. I mean, gosh, do we wish we had a recording of that. And because of his powerful words, it passes the day. If he hadn't, who knows where we'd be and how much longer it would have taken women to get the vote. And all along the way, you had men. It's a much smaller group, to be honest, in the beginning. But as you go along, as more women are recruited, they recruit the men in their lives. And one of the interesting things that you see happen is you start to see the second and third generation of suffragists include men whose mothers and sisters and wives and all the most important people in their lives were suffragists, to the point where when you finally get to the very end, I love to talk about the first time they tried to pass suffrage in the U.S. House of Representatives. They had 4 men who were brought in on stretchers to be able to vote for suffrage. You have to get 2/3 of the vote. And it was going to be very, very close. And they have one gentleman a representative from Tennessee, who has a broken shoulder, but he doesn't want to have it set. Because he wants to make sure he doesn't get knocked out. He wants to be there to vote for suffrage, and then he doesn't leave after he votes because he wants to make everybody else in the roll call feel guilty and get them to vote for suffrage. You have another man who comes from the deathbed of his wife in New York, and she had been an ardent suffragist, and this was his last promise to her. So he comes down, votes for suffrage, has to turn around and go up to plan her funeral. I mean, you have these amazing stories. It only passes in 1918 by 1 vote. And when the women who are in the galleries hear this, they pour out of the galleries of the house singing, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." And then, of course, it doesn't pass the Senate, so they have to start all over again. But it eventually does pass the Senate, and it gets out to the ratifications. And a lot of the states, especially the states where women already could vote, they're rushing to see who can pass it first. Wisconsin, by the way, gets the first one in. But it starts to trickle down, and finally, you know, you start to have a lot of southern states who reject it. My state, Virginia, doesn't ratify the 19th Amendment until 1952. But it finally is going to come down to Tennessee, and this whole horde of people converge on it. You know, and Beck was talking about how you have all sorts of different people involved in the movement. Sometimes you have people who you're surprised, you know, people say men were involved. Well, not only were men involved as allies, there were women who were working against suffrage, which always surprises me, frankly. But it was very tight, comes down in Tennessee. There are all these different forces. Everything's going on, lots of lobbying, lots of liquor lobbying, and there are rumors that, you know, there are drunken legislators who are being pulled in by the liquor lobby to vote against it and things like that. Finally comes down to a vote in the House, the Tennessee House, and they're pretty sure that it's going to be tabled. That's going to be it, and no more. And then Harry Byrne, this young man, stands up, and he actually, people thought he was anti-suffragist, and he winds up giving the final vote for suffrage. So Tennessee ratifies it and becomes the 19th Amendment. And later on, when he comes out, you know, he gives 5 or 6 different reasons, but the only one anyone pays any attention to is he says, well, my mother wrote me a letter telling me to do it, and every good boy knows he should follow the advice of his mother, which is what I tell my children. but you know, those personal relationships, those allies that you get are so important, and women had them all along, and we were lucky to have them. And you know, that's something that I think really is very fundamental. And if you're trying to get something changed, think about your allies.
Yeah, it's a huge lesson that we should all carry forward. I know that's part of what this is about the playbook, and I know in our closing moments here, but folks, there's so many great things here. Telling your story, setting a goal, never give up, engage a wider audience, be bold when you get stuck, don't always do what you're told, pay attention. This is the PR guy talking to. Pay attention to how things look. Do your homework, recruit the allies that you need, just as Lucinda said. You know, I'm thinking of one thing, and I know we're getting short on time here, but I have one other thing. I can't help thinking, and this is something I've been noodling a lot over in my day job, is how it's pretty evident that the term defund the police had a destructive effect down ballot for the Democrats. And to me, it was a case of that it was a sentiment that was understandable considering what happened, but the way it was phrased, unfortunately, had terrifically bad effects on the movement as a whole. So, I mean, that's, to me, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but that seems like a very contemporary, real life example of really, you know, paying attention to how things look and sound.
No question. And I think that the corollary to that is that if you aren't paying attention to how things look and sound, then someone else is going to define it for you. And so how many times have we heard a piece of legislation called different names by pros and cons to try to get public opinion swayed one way or another? You know, one person's dreamers or another person's illegal immigrants. And the suffragists hit this again and again. Lucinda talked about Frances Willard and turning suffrage into the home protection ballot for conservative women. But you saw it in terms of suffrage, figuring out what message was going to work for which people and how you could address the antis, who of course evolve, right? That's the other thing, is you better be good at understanding your opposition because their minds are changing too. There's incremental progress on the opposite side as well. And so if you don't think through who is receiving what message by what medium, from what source, someone else is going to do it for you. And I see this all the time with activists doing it well or doing it poorly. Yeah.
And it's all here in the book. Just a couple of quick points here. You get to when it finally does pass. This is right out of your book. Voting isn't everything. And in fact, you say in the first vote in 1920, only 33% of women actually voted, and mostly the same way as the men did. And it's the great line you guys have here. It's the general reaction was meh. It just seemed like kind of a letdown in a way. But is that a good letdown though?
Well, it spurred, you know, a bunch of pearl clutching editorials about, you know, suffrage a mistake. And it really was just increasing the power of their husbands and fathers and sons because the women are voting just like the men did. Okay, that's one interpretation. Or maybe it's that Women were voting along demographic lines that were different from their gender, that they were voting about, where they lived in the country, what socioeconomic class they were in, what race they were in, what the priorities of their region were, and those were more like the men in their lives. That changed over time. By the 1980s, women voted substantially differently from men, and the gender gap has expanded in every election since. So now women are significantly more Democratic and men are significantly more Republican. But it took a while for that vote to mature in terms of people voting along lines that weren't dominated by other priorities. The other thing, and Lucinda is very big on this, is that voting's a habit, right? And you need to get into the habit just like anything else. So while there were a lot of women who were very excited about the chance of voting in the 1920 general election, that's why there was the big push for Tennessee to be the final vote that summer. A lot of them had just never done it before. And you need to learn how to do it. You need for it to become a habit. You need for it to become regularized. It had been demonized. People, antis were telling women that it would be dangerous and that they'd be under some kind of a threat if they went to the polls, and that they were rejecting their children and families if they went to the polls. Like the messaging had been so powerful for so long that it's not that surprising. I mean, actually, I think 33% is pretty amazing considering the roadblocks that were thrown up to registration before the 1920 election and all of that. But as you see over time, now women reliably vote more than men do. The highest turnout demographic in America is Black women, and they change elections. So maybe it took 100 years, but the power continues and is permanent.
And it's worth noting that the 19th Amendment, as important as it was, it's really only one rung in the step of this ladder of democracy as we're sort of constantly working towards a more perfect union. You don't have, I think one of the big differences between celebrating the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the 100th anniversary is a much greater recognition of how many people still couldn't vote. And theoretically they could vote, but realistically, no, not quite. So you don't have until the 1965 Civil Rights Act that you have getting rid of a lot of the Jim Crow laws in the South that prevent Black men and women from voting. And it is always something that each generation has to figure out. Again, they say that you have to sort of vote 3 times before it really sticks. But as Becca said, now more women vote than men, not just in numbers. I don't think we have the numbers yet for this most recent election, but in the 2016 presidential election, you had 10 million more women than men voting. This election, it will probably be even more because women represent, if nothing else, a greater percentage of the population as a whole, but they also vote in higher percentages. So it's a constantly evolving progress, and you can't take your eye off the ball. You can't take it for granted and think, well, it won't matter anymore. Each generation has to figure out what they're going to add, what they're going to do. We think that's what makes it fun.
And the habits there. I mean, I vote at every bond issue. I vote at everything, and my daughter is observed. I take her to the polls. This leads me to my last question for you. And this is a bit editorializing, surprise, but one need only turn on the TV or start doom scrolling the internet, and you see this large vocal minority of people who seem completely, again, this is my opinion, completely ignorant of how a republic is formed, the norms that strengthen it, and how it can be damaged or destroyed with apathy. I'm so concerned about this that I think civics education is not strong enough in this country. I actually purchased an at-home curriculum from iCivics.org. So Caroline and I, my daughter, Caroline and I, 1 hour a week, because she's working from home, student from home because of lockdown, we have an hour a week where she's there, right there with me. We're reading the assignments together. We're doing the activities, and she's soaking it up like a sponge. I think it's criminal that we do not have a nationally mandated civics curriculum in this country. And so when I see a book like this, the Suffragist Playbook, and I think, okay, well, that's just been added to Caroline's curriculum. Now, she'll be thrilled once she reads it, but when I bring the book down and say, hey, by the way, this is some more reading for you, you know what they'll do. She's 12, come on. But I wanted to ask you that if you didn't mind sharing your opinions on, both of you, on the state of civics education and the effects, the deleterious effects we're having on our country for the lack of it.
I mean, I think we both feel very strongly about the institutions of American democracy. We are both, have many members of our family who held elected office, and we believe in the system. I think that we wrote this book in part because we are patriots and we want America to succeed. And so we also acknowledge that we both grew up in political families inside the Beltway, you know, where it was what we drank with our, you know, evening meals. It just, we were so ingrained with those lessons that it can be sort of hard for us to recognize that that is, the normal families don't discuss what bills in Senate markup over dinner, right? And so we, I think that's a big part of what we wanted this book to do, was not just highlight this important part of American history, not just include women where they have been left out very often, not just give contemporary activist tools they can use to succeed, but also just sort of underline that American democracy is vital, and that if you don't like it, here are ways you can change it. And the system for changing it is rough. Amending the Constitution is really, really hard, as it should be. But that is the way you participate, and that is the way you show your patriotism, is to make your country better by using the systems in place to do it. I think we both feel very strongly about that.
And I think that's one of the things, all of these tactics that we talk about are ones that you can use because of your First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, to petition, to free speech. These are all tools that even women before they had the vote had available to them, and that we have available to us today. And I think that's important. I love to hear that you're doing this at-home curriculum. I'm on the board of the National Archives Foundation, and we talk about civics education all the time. It is the biggest topic at our board meetings, and in fact there are lots of different groups that want to be involved, including you know, a lot of educational institutions, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There are all sorts of people who are like you, care and are focused on civics education. And I think one of the things you have to try to do is make it fun, because you always remember things that go down with a little more sugar. And I think that's what Becca and I were hoping to do in this book, is to make it very conversational. We tried not to put in every single date and all that sort of stuff. We really wanted to stick to the stories in the hopes that some of this information would be memorable. And you're right. I think civics education is absolutely vital, and every generation needs to learn it anew.
It's very evident, and I am thrilled to hear that, you know, that there are other people out there. I know there's other people out there like me. We're not from, technically we're a political family. I ran for state legislature a couple of times, didn't make it in, but I love to take that experience and tell my daughter at the dinner table, by the way, we're one of those families, dinner, no devices, we talk. I'm a huge RFK buff, and I know that's he with his massive family, you know, they would talk, and I'm sure your families did the same. And of course, it didn't hurt that I spent a lot of Sunday mornings with Cokie Roberts and Sam Donaldson and David Brinkley. Oh my gosh. You're not going to believe that. I mean, when I was Caroline's age, that's what I was watching, those things. Maybe it's just, wow. Maybe I'm a total nerd, but I just wanted to thank you for that.
Love nerds.
You know, I'm a nerd for democracy. What can I tell you? I hate fascism. Sorry. Listeners, the book is The Suffragist Playbook, your guide to changing the world. You can get it as an ebook, hardcover, and it's an audiobook as well. It's available on Amazon and where else? Everywhere?
We have a website, Suffragist Playbook, and
.org.
.org. Thank you, Becca. And also, you can get it at your local or indie bookstore. Particularly in these times, we're recommending that as well.
Yeah, sorry to drop the A word there. It seems, you know, it's just where people go. But definitely the local bookstore. I was actually looking to see if our local library was stocking it yet. Not sure yet, but I will be making a call. This is important. Last question: is this something that can be bought up by school systems or by teachers at a rate they could afford to get it into classrooms?
Yes, I think that's actually, you know, everything has been very weird with the pandemic, and not that this has made the news, but even the publishing industry has been behind in things. So the book actually has come out a little slower than it was originally supposed to. And now with people actually not even being in schools in so many different places, things are a little weird, but I think that is something that our publisher is particularly interested in, is getting it into libraries, getting it into schools. And we've done a lot of conversations about coming up with specifically lesson plans to teachers to be able to use it. And again, to make it easy, to make it fun, something that, that is, people will enjoy and remember.
Well, you've succeeded there, and I'll just say it again. Caroline will love this because the tone in which it's written, it's fun and it's interesting and it's beautiful. It's got really nice art, and it's a handy little reinforced book, so kids can rough it up a little bit. But it's not just for kids. I'm certainly learning a lot from reading it, folks. So again, Lucinda Robb, who has the most prodigious Pez dispenser collection I have ever seen, apparently. My goodness, how many do you have? Just please, real quick.
I have over 500. I actually wrote Pez and told them they ought to have a suffragist special edition. I have not heard back about getting a Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and Lucy Stone set of Pez, but wouldn't it be neat if they had them?
I'll tell you what, we'll help out on that. It's funny, I used to collect Pez myself, but I thought I'd corner the market on them years ago when eBay came along, but I took a bath on those Pez dispensers, I'm here to tell you. Anyway, Lucinda Robb and Rebecca Boggs Roberts, it's been an education and a delight speaking with you today on behalf of my daughter Caroline and indeed all young people who will take over the reins of this country someday. Thank you very much for this book, and thanks for being here on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a treat.
Thank you. This was a blast.
Thanks so much for listening to Mysterious Goings On. Don't forget we have a complete archive of all of our interviews, monologues, updates, live readings, dead readings. All of that stuff is available at mgopod.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. Please join us there. Again, don't forget, mgopod.com also has links where to find me on social media and how to get in touch in case you want to be a guest here on the show. Well, I think it's time that I move on for this week, but until next time, keep reading.